London is home to around 8.9 million people today, and nearly 40% of those people were born in another country. That makes it one of the most diverse and multicultural cities on the face of the earth. Now you might think that this diversity is something new, something that only happened because the modern world has become so connected and so open. But London has actually been a home to people from all over the world for the past 2,000 years. From the Romans to the Normans, from the Tudors to the Victorians, London has always sat at the center of history. Empires were built from it. Political movements started inside it. Wars nearly destroyed it, and cultures from every corner of the planet layered themselves onto its streets one century at a time, slowly building the city we know today. So the question is this: how did a small settlement on the edge of a Roman river grow into one of the greatest and most powerful cities the world has ever seen? This is how London became the capital of the world. Part 1. The Romans and the birth of Londinium. The story of London begins almost 2,000 years ago, and it begins not with the British people, but with an invading army from across the sea. When Roman legions landed on the island of Britain in the year 43 AD, they needed a base. They needed somewhere strategically placed, somewhere they could build a bridge across the river, somewhere that connected easily to the wider network of roads and sea routes that the Roman Empire depended on. They found that place on the northern bank of the River Thames, and they named their new settlement Londinium. In the beginning, Londinium was small and very vulnerable. Just 17 years after it was founded, a Celtic queen named Boudicca led a massive armed rebellion against the Roman occupiers. Her forces swept through the southeastern part of the country in the year 60 AD, and when they reached Londinium, they burned it to the ground. They destroyed it so completely that archaeologists can still find a thick layer of ash beneath modern London that dates back to that exact moment. Boudicca's rebellion was eventually crushed by Roman forces, and her defeat opened the door to a full rebuilding of the city. What rose from those ashes was something far more impressive than what had come before. A great forum was built in the 80s AD, along with a basilica that was the largest ever constructed north of the Alps. The Romans added temples, bathhouses, an amphitheater, and a large military garrison to protect the city. By the turn of the 1st century, as many as 60,000 people were living in Londinium. It had become the provincial capital of Britannia, replacing the older settlement of Camulodunum, which is the city we now call Colchester. Between the years 190 and 225 AD, the Romans built a great defensive wall around the city to protect it from future attacks. That wall defined the boundary of London for many centuries to come. It contained 6 of the city's 7 historic gates: Ludgate, Newgate, Aldersgate, Cripplegate, Bishopsgate, and Aldgate. The 7th gate, Moorgate, was only added much later during medieval times. The wall was so well built that large sections of it are still standing in London today. But empires do not last forever. By the 5th century, the Roman Empire was collapsing under the weight of its own overextension. In the year 410, the last Roman legion left Britain, ending almost 400 years of Roman rule over the island. Without the empire to support it, Londinium was gradually abandoned. The streets fell quiet. The buildings crumbled. One of the most impressive cities in the ancient Western world simply emptied out and was left to decay. You are watching Backdoor Economics, the channel that takes you deep inside the stories that shape the world. Hit subscribe right now so you never miss a single one. Part 2. The Anglo-Saxons and a New London. It was not until the arrival of the Anglo-Saxons that London was given a new chance at life. These Germanic tribes had been migrating across the North Sea from what is now northern Germany and Denmark ever since the 5th and 6th centuries. When they found the old Roman city, they made an interesting choice. Instead of moving into it, they left it empty and built their own new settlement to the west of the Roman walls, in the area around what is today Covent Garden. They called this place Londonwick. By the late 7th century, Londonwick had a population of around 10,000 people. It had a busy and prosperous port on the river, and it was home to an important early church. In the year 604, the first post-Roman bishop of London, a man named Mellitus, founded the very first version of St. Paul's Cathedral on the site where it still stands today. The presence of this Christian place of worship helped spread Christianity among the Anglo-Saxon people in the decades that followed. But prosperity always attracts attention, and not always the kind you want. By the 9th century, Londonwick was rich enough to attract raiders from overseas. The Viking Age had begun with the famous attack on the monastery at Lindisfarne in 793, and from that point on, wealthy trading centers and monasteries all across the British Isles became targets. London recorded its first Viking raid in the 830s. At first, the attacks were quick hit-and-run affairs, but they grew more serious and more frequent as the years passed. In the year 871, the Vikings stopped raiding and started occupying. The Great Heathen Army, as it was called, moved into London and set up camp within the old abandoned Roman walls. For 15 years, London remained under Viking control. Then, in 886, a man who would later become one of the most celebrated figures in English history recaptured the city. Alfred the Great drove the Vikings out and immediately ordered that the Anglo-Saxon settlement of Londonwick be moved back inside the protection of the old Roman walls. He had the walls repaired, the bridge across the river rebuilt, and the city reorganized as a proper defensible urban center. The settlement was renamed Lundenburg, and London, as a great city, was truly born again. Part 3. From Anglo-Saxon city to Norman capital. Over the following centuries, London grew steadily in both size and importance. It faced competition from Winchester, which was the traditional capital of the Anglo-Saxon kingdom, and it suffered further Viking raids in the 10th and early 11th centuries. But London was resilient. It survived every attack, and its wealth and commercial importance kept growing. A major moment came when King Edward the Confessor decided to make London a new center of royal power. He ordered the construction of Westminster Abbey, which was completed around 1060 and consecrated just before his death in January 1066. Westminster Abbey immediately became the most important royal church in the country. Edward himself was the first of 18 monarchs to be buried within its walls, and his successor, Harold Godwinson, became the first of 40 kings and queens to be crowned inside the building. That tradition of coronations at Westminster continues to this day. The year 1066 changed London and the whole of England forever. Duke William of Normandy crossed the Channel from France, defeated the Anglo-Saxon King Harold at the Battle of Hastings, and then marched directly to London. On Christmas Day, 1066, he was crowned King of England inside Westminster Abbey. The Norman Conquest had begun, and London would never be quite the same again. William immediately set about making his power impossible to ignore. He ordered fortresses to be built across the country, and inside London, he constructed several new strongholds to keep the local population under control. The most famous of these was built at the eastern end of the city, where a timber fortress was eventually replaced by the first stone castle ever built in England. This was the beginning of the Tower of London, a building that would be expanded and developed over the following centuries, and that would come to represent royal power more than any other structure in the country. At this point in history, London was the largest and most important city in England, but it was not yet officially the capital. Winchester still held that title because most of the royal institutions remained based there. That began to change when a fire destroyed much of Winchester in the 11th century, forcing the royal offices to relocate to London. And in 1097, King William II began building Westminster Hall, which would eventually grow into the home of the English Parliament. London's rise to political dominance was now complete. Part 4. Medieval London. Through the medieval period, London grew at a remarkable pace. Its population rose from around 15,000 in the year 1100 to more than 80,000 by 1300. Most of that growth came from within England as people moved to the city in search of work and opportunity. But London was also home to significant communities of people from other countries: French wine merchants, Flemish textile traders, Danish and German sailors, and a sizable Jewish community that had arrived in England after the Norman Conquest. All made their homes within the city's walls. Most of medieval London was still contained within the old Roman walls, but the area south of the river, known as Southwark, was also developing. A wooden bridge had crossed the Thames for centuries, but in 1176, work began on a permanent stone replacement. The new London Bridge was completed in 1209. It had a gatehouse at its southern end and was lined on both sides with tall buildings that rose several stories high and jutted out over the water. For more than 600 years, this was the only place in London where people could cross the river on foot. London's political institutions were also taking shape during this period. The first recorded mayor of the City of London, a man named Henry Fitzaylwin, took office in 1189, and in 1215 the Magna Carta, signed by King John, formally confirmed London's right to govern itself. This was hugely significant because it established London as a place with unique privileges, separate from the control of the monarch, and governed instead by its own citizens and their elected representatives. The merchants who controlled London's trade organized themselves into guilds, which were professional associations that set the rules and standards for their particular industry. The oldest of these, the Weavers' Company, was granted its royal charter as far back as 1155. Many others followed: the mercers, the goldsmiths, the ironmongers, the brewers, the butchers, and dozens more. These guilds gave London's commercial life a structure and a discipline that helped it become one of the greatest trading cities in the world. But medieval London was not only prosperous, it was also dirty, crowded, and dangerous. The tightly packed streets were perfect conditions for disease to spread, and in 1348, the most devastating epidemic in European history arrived in the city. The Black Death killed people at a rate of around 200 a day at its peak, and it tore through London's population with horrifying speed and efficiency. Social order also broke down regularly in medieval London. The most dramatic example came in 1381 with the Peasants' Revolt, when thousands of ordinary people from the surrounding countryside marched on London to protest against heavy taxes. They poured into the city and ransacked it, destroying wealthy buildings and killing government officials. It was a terrifying demonstration of just how fragile the peace in medieval London really was. For those who broke the law and were caught, punishment was very public and very brutal. Criminals convicted of lesser offenses might be locked in the stocks or the pillory in a public square, where crowds would gather to mock them. Those convicted of more serious crimes and sentenced to death were taken to execution grounds at Tyburn, Smithfield, or Tower Hill, where large crowds would watch the sentence carried out. The entire purpose was to make an example visible to everyone. Part 5. Tudor London. The beginning of the 16th century and the arrival of the Tudor dynasty marked the start of a major new chapter in London's story. The city began to appear on maps, for the first time in any serious way, and those maps revealed how much it was growing. A panoramic view of London produced by the Flemish artist Anton van den Wingerde in 1543 showed that the city had already begun to push far beyond its old medieval walls, spreading westward in the direction of Westminster. The population grew dramatically during the Tudor period, rising from around 50,000 people in 1530 to more than 200,000 by the year 1600. People came from all across England, drawn by the promise of higher wages and the chance to build a better life. London's trade networks also expanded far beyond Europe during this time, reaching all the way to Russia, the Americas, Africa, and India. Merchants organized themselves into powerful trading companies such as the Muscovy Company and the East India Company, which laid the economic foundation for what would eventually become the British Empire. When Tudor Londoners were not working, they were looking for entertainment, and they found it in abundance. Inns, taverns, and other establishments had existed for many centuries, but the defining cultural invention of the Tudor era was the public theater. Plays had been performed in inns and private houses for years, but they became so popular that purpose-built theaters began to appear. In 1574, the City of London banned theaters from operating within its walls, forcing builders to construct them just outside the city boundaries instead. The most famous of all these was the Globe Theatre in Southwark, which staged many of the most celebrated works of William Shakespeare and defined an entire age of English culture. Part 6. Stuart London and a Century of Crisis. When Queen Elizabeth I died in 1603 and the Stuart dynasty took over the throne, London entered one of the most turbulent and transformative periods in its long history. Several catastrophic events struck the city in quick succession, and each one changed it permanently. The first came in 1605, when a group of English Catholics hatched a plan to blow up King James I during the state opening of Parliament on the 5th of November. The plot was discovered at the last moment when authorities found one of the conspirators, Guy Fawkes, guarding barrels of gunpowder in the basement beneath the Parliament building. The conspirators were arrested, tried, and executed in Westminster, and the dramatic failure of what became known as the Gunpowder Plot sent a very clear message about the kind of violence that simmered beneath the surface of early Stuart society. Worse was to come. When King Charles I inherited the throne in 1625, he began governing in an increasingly authoritarian way that put him on a direct collision course with Parliament. The tension escalated until it exploded into full civil war across England in 1642. The people of London overwhelmingly sided with the parliamentarian cause and built a ring of defensive fortifications around the entire city to protect it from a royalist attack. Within a few years, Parliament's forces had gained the upper hand across the country, and King Charles IV was captured. He was put on trial for treason, found guilty, and on the 30th of January 1649, he was beheaded outside the Banqueting House in London in front of a large crowd. England became a republic, and London remained its political center. The monarchy was restored in 1660, when King Charles II was welcomed back to the throne and crowned at Westminster the following year. But London's troubles were far from over. In 1665, the plague returned to the city and killed an estimated 60,000 people, roughly a quarter of the entire population at the time. Then, just 1 year later, disaster struck again. A fire broke out in a bakery on Pudding Lane in the early hours of the 2nd of September 1666 and quickly spread through the tightly packed wooden buildings of the old city. By the time it was brought under control, the Great Fire of London had destroyed the vast majority of the buildings inside the old medieval walls, including the original St. Paul's Cathedral. The rebuilding that followed the fire transformed London physically and permanently. New regulations insisted that buildings be constructed in brick and stone rather than wood, making the city far less vulnerable to fire in the future. The architect, Sir Christopher Wren, was put in charge of redesigning much of the city center. He rebuilt St. Paul's Cathedral in the grand domed form it still has today, reconstructed 52 other churches across the city, and designed a tall column monument to the fire itself that still stands at the location where the fire began. Beyond the old city walls, the fashionable West End of London began to develop rapidly during this period. The aristocracy built grand mansions, elegant theaters, and stylish coffee houses in areas like Covent Garden and St. James's. This created a clear geographic divide in the city. To the west was the wealthy, refined world of the royal court and the aristocracy. To the east was the commercial city of London, home to the offices of the Bank of England, the East India Company, and the insurance market Lloyd's of London, all of which powered the international trade flowing through the city's expanding docklands. Part 7. 18th century London. By the time the 18th century began, London had 500,000 people living within it. It was one of the largest cities in the world, and it was growing fast. Its population was becoming increasingly diverse, including not only European immigrants like the Irish and Jewish communities, but also people arriving from Africa, the Caribbean, and Asia, who had come to Britain through the networks of trade and empire that London sat at the center of. Several of London's most recognizable landmarks came into existence during this century. Number 10, Downing Street became the official residence of the British Prime Minister in 1732, with Robert Walpole being the first person to live there in that role. Buckingham Palace was purchased by King George III in 1761 and gradually remodeled into the royal family's official London home. New bridges were built across the Thames to ease the growing pressure on London Bridge, with Westminster Bridge opening in 1750 and Blackfriars Bridge opening in 1769. The city was spreading rapidly outward in every direction, connecting villages and towns that had previously been separate from London into one continuous urban area. The commercial life of the city was booming, fueled by Britain's growing position as the dominant trading and imperial power in the world. London was becoming something that no city had ever quite been before, a global hub through which money, goods, people, and ideas from every part of the world were constantly flowing. Part 8. Victorian London. By the time the 19th century arrived, London had crossed a threshold that no city had ever crossed before. It had become the largest city on Earth, with a population of over 1 million people. And that was just the beginning. By the end of the century, the population had risen to 6.7 million, a number almost impossible to imagine for a single city at that time. The Industrial Revolution was the engine driving this enormous growth. Factories multiplied across the city and its surrounding areas, and people poured in from the countryside looking for work. Many of them found jobs, but many also found themselves crowded into dark, filthy, and desperately overcrowded slum districts with almost no sanitation or clean water. The poverty and suffering of these communities was captured by the novelist Charles Dickens, whose book Oliver Twist painted an unflinching picture of what life was like for the poorest Londoners. As the population grew and crime increased, the authorities realized that the old informal systems of law enforcement were no longer adequate. In 1829, the Home Secretary Robert Peel created the Metropolitan Police, the first professional police force in London and one of the first in the world. The force would go on to handle some of the city's most infamous criminal cases, including the hunt for Jack the Ripper, who murdered several women in the East End in the late 1880s in a case that was never solved and that still captures the public imagination today. The single most transformative development in Victorian London was the arrival of the railways. The first railway lines into the city opened in the 1830s, and they set off an enormous wave of outward expansion. Middle-class families who could afford the train fare moved out of the crowded city centre into new suburbs that sprang up around the new railway stations. The major London termini, Euston, Paddington, Waterloo, King's Cross, and St. Pancras, became powerful centres of movement and commerce. And connecting all of them beneath the streets of the city was the world's first underground railway network, the London Underground, which opened in 1863. In 1851, London put itself on display for the entire world with the Great Exhibition at Crystal Palace in Hyde Park. The exhibition showed off the best of British manufacturing, science, art, and culture, and it attracted 6 million visitors from around the globe. It was a celebration of Britain at the absolute peak of its imperial and industrial power, and London was its proud host. Other major landmarks that we still associate with London today were built during the Victorian era. Trafalgar Square, Big Ben, the Houses of Parliament, and Tower Bridge all came into existence during the 19th century and gave the city the famous skyline it still largely retains. Yet behind this grand public face, London was also dealing with a serious and growing crisis beneath its streets and in its river. The Thames had always been used as the place where the city disposed of its waste, both human and industrial. By the middle of the 19th century, the amount of sewage flowing into the river had reached a point where it was creating a public health emergency. In the hot summer of 1858, the smell rising from the river became so overpowering that it was physically impossible to work in buildings near the waterfront. Parliament itself was affected. People called it the Great Stink. A solution was urgently needed, and it was found by a civil engineer named Joseph Bazalgette, who designed and built a comprehensive new sewer system that redirected London's waste far downstream to the east. The sewers he built were so well constructed and so well designed that many of them are still in use today. His work ended the regular outbreaks of cholera that had been killing thousands of Londoners, and he is widely considered to have saved more lives through his engineering than any other individual in Victorian history. Part 9. London in the 20th century. The most dramatic and most destructive changes London experienced came in the 20th century, when 2 world wars brought violence and death directly to the streets of the city for the first time in modern history. The First World War introduced London to aerial bombing. German airships called Zeppelins flew over the city and dropped bombs on residential and commercial areas, killing around 670 people and causing widespread panic. It was a preview of something far worse to come. The war also took approximately 124,000 London men to the front lines of France and Belgium, and a very large number of them never came home. The Second World War brought destruction on a scale that London had never experienced before. Even before the bombing started, the authorities evacuated tens of thousands of London's children to the countryside to keep them safe. The adults who remained built air raid shelters in their gardens and crowded into underground stations during the raids to wait out the attacks below ground. The most intense period of bombing was known as the Blitz, which lasted from September 1940 to May 1941. During those 8 months, German aircraft carried out 71 separate raids on the city, dropping more than 18,000 tons of explosives. The old city of London and the docklands to the east suffered the heaviest damage, with enormous areas being reduced to rubble. Remarkably, St. Paul's Cathedral survived the entire Blitz without serious damage, and photographs of its dome rising above the smoke and destruction became one of the most powerful symbols of London's refusal to be broken. By the end of the war, approximately 30,000 Londoners had been killed by the bombing, and hundreds of thousands had lost their homes. The years after the war brought a very different kind of change. Much of the old Victorian housing, already crowded and damaged, was cleared away and replaced with new buildings and housing estates. Large numbers of new immigrants arrived in the city, many of them coming from countries that had been part of the British Empire, from the Caribbean, from India, from Pakistan, and from Africa. These new communities brought with them their own languages, foods, religions, and cultural traditions, and they added them to the already rich mixture of peoples that London had been accumulating for 2,000 years. In the 1960s, London also became the center of a global cultural revolution. The music, the fashion, and the attitude that came out of London during the swinging 60s captured the imagination of the entire world. British bands like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones became the most famous musicians on the planet. London was suddenly not just a political or financial capital, it was a cultural capital too. As the 21st century began, London had fully established itself as one of the great world cities. Every nationality on earth is now represented within its boundaries. Almost every language is spoken on its streets. Nearly 40% of its residents were born in another country, making it one of the most diverse urban populations anywhere on the planet. But this is not something new. This is the result of 2,000 years of history. The Romans brought organization and infrastructure. The Anglo-Saxons brought trade and Christianity. The Vikings brought conflict and eventually settlement. The Normans brought a new ruling class and a new language. The medieval merchants brought wealth and political institutions. The Tudors brought cultural explosion and global commerce. The Stuarts brought crisis and transformation. The Georgians brought stability and expansion. The Victorians brought industry and engineering on a scale the world had never seen. The survivors of 2 world wars brought resilience and a determination to rebuild. And every wave of immigration from every corner of the globe brought new energy, new ideas, and new life to a city that has always been defined by its openness to the world. From the Romans to the Normans, and from the Tudors to the Victorians, London's unique position throughout history has made it something more than just a capital city. It has made it perhaps the most remarkable city in human history, and for a very long time, the capital of the world. Thank you for watching Backdoor Economics. How London became the capital of the world. If this story gave you something to think about, leave a comment below, share this video, and make sure you are subscribed to Backdoor Economics so you never miss the next chapter of history. Every great city has a story, and this one is far from over.